There are things a man carries that never leave him. Not in his pockets or his hands, but deeper, in the marrow of his bones, in the silence between heartbeats. I'm 55 years old now, and I've kept this secret for more than half my life. Every morning I wake up and feel its weight pressing against my chest like a stone I swallowed years ago. My name is John, and 20 years ago, I hid something in the woods of northern Maine that the world believes is only legend. I protected it. I fed it. I lied for it. And when I close my eyes at night, I can still see the way it looked at me that first time. Not with hunger, but with something I never expected to find in those ancient eyes. Understanding. Before all of this, my life was simple in the way that only isolation can make it. I worked as a forest ranger in the Allagash wilderness, hundreds of miles from anything resembling civilization. My cabin sat at the edge of a vast stretch of pine and birch, where the only sounds were wind through branches and the distant call of loons across black water. I'd chosen this life deliberately after my divorce. Wanted distance from people, from their noise and complications. Out here, the rules were different, clearer. You kept your fire going, you respected the weather, you watched for signs. My days followed the rhythm of the seasons. Summer meant checking trails and monitoring for fires. Autumn brought hunters I had to track and sometimes redirect. Winter was the test. Weeks where the temperature dropped to 20 below and the snow piled so high against my cabin walls that I had to dig myself out each morning just to reach the woodshed. I was 41 that October when everything changed. The aspens had turned gold and the air carried that particular sharpness that comes before the first real snow. I'd been following wolf tracks for 3 days, part of a wildlife survey the state had requested. The tracks led deeper into territory I rarely patrolled. Old-growth forest where the trees grew so thick that even at noon, the light came down in thin gray shafts. The underbrush was dense with deadfall and moss-covered stones, and there was a heaviness to the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I should have turned back. Every instinct I'd developed over 15 years in these woods told me to mark my position and return with better equipment. But I kept going, drawn forward by something I couldn't name. That's when I found the clearing. It wasn't natural. Trees had been torn apart, their trunks shredded and scattered like kindling. The ground was churned up, dark earth mixed with pine needles and something else. Blood. A lot of it, already starting to freeze in the cold. The smell hit me then, sharp and metallic with an undertone of something rotten, something wrong. My hand went to the rifle on my shoulder, and I stood there in that destroyed clearing with my heart hammering against my ribs. Whatever had done this was big, powerful, and somewhere close. I heard it before I saw it. A sound like breathing, but deeper, rattling in a chest too large. It came from a collapsed section of earth near the base of an ancient pine. A den, maybe, or just a depression where the roots had created a hollow. I approached slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. My finger rested on the trigger guard as I looked down into that darkness. And then I saw the eyes. Not the eyes of an animal, but something else entirely. They were pale, almost colorless, set in a face that was wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. The skull was elongated, covered in matted gray mixed with bare patches of skin that looked like old leather. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth that were too long, too many. But it was the expression that stopped me cold. Not aggression. Not the blank stare of a predator. This thing was terrified. It was wounded badly. I could see where bullets had torn into its shoulder and flank. Hunters, probably, who'd stumbled onto something they couldn't explain and reacted with fear. The creature tried to pull itself deeper into the hollow, and the movement sent fresh blood pooling across the frozen ground. It made a sound then, low and almost mournful, and I understood with absolute clarity that it was dying. I should have left. Should have radioed for help or simply walked away and let nature take its course. Instead, I knelt there in the dirt and snow, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its body, and I made a choice that would define the next 20 years of my life. I stayed. I don't know why, even now. Maybe it was the loneliness I saw reflected in those pale eyes. Maybe it was because for the first time in years, I felt something other than numb. Whatever the reason, as the sun set and the temperature dropped, I built a fire at the mouth of that den and kept watch through the night, my rifle across my lap, protecting something the world would kill on sight. The decision to help it didn't come all at once. That first night I told myself I was just observing, documenting something science would want to know about. But when dawn broke cold and gray, and I saw the creature still breathing in shallow, painful gasps, I knew I'd already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I hiked back to my cabin, loaded a pack with medical supplies, antibiotics meant for livestock, bandages, iodine, and returned before noon. The whole time, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the weight of what I was doing. I was 41 years old, and I'd spent my entire adult life following rules, staying within boundaries. Now here I was, preparing to treat wounds on something that shouldn't exist. It took 3 days before the creature let me close enough to touch it. 3 days of sitting at the edge of that den, talking in low, steady tones about nothing in particular. My childhood in Vermont, the patterns of weather I'd learned to read, the way light changed through the seasons. I think it was the sound of my voice more than the words that mattered. On the third evening, as I was cleaning my rifle by firelight, it extended one massive hand toward me. The fingers were too long, tipped with claws that could have torn me apart, but the gesture was unmistakable. Trust. Or maybe just exhaustion. I cleaned the wounds as best I could, working by flashlight while the creature remained perfectly still. The flesh beneath that matted fur was hot with infection, and I used most of my antibiotics in those first treatments. When I finally sat back, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold, the creature made a sound. Not quite a growl, but something deeper, almost like words trapped in a throat not meant for speaking. Over the following weeks, I fell into a routine that consumed my life. I'd complete my ranger duties during the day, checking in by radio, filing reports, maintaining the pretense of normalcy. Then, as soon as darkness fell, I'd pack supplies and make the 2-hour hike to the den. I brought food at first, venison from my freezer, dried fish, but I quickly learned it needed more. It needed to hunt, but the injuries had left it too weak. So I began hunting for it. Deer, mostly, sometimes moose when I could bring one down. I'd field dress the carcass and haul it through the forest in the dead of night, my back screaming with the effort, leaving trails I had to carefully obscure before dawn. The creature ate slowly, almost reverently, and I understood that it had been starving long before those bullets found it. By January, it had healed enough to move. I watched it stand for the first time, unfolding to a height that made my throat tight with instinctive fear. It had to be 9 feet tall, maybe more, with shoulders broad enough that it had to turn sideways to exit the den. But the fear lasted only a moment. Because when it looked at me in the moonlight filtering through bare branches, I saw something I'd never expected to find in those pale eyes. Gratitude. We stood there in the snow, man and creature, our breath fogging in the bitter air, and an understanding passed between us that needed no words. I would keep it secret. It would stay hidden. And neither of us would be quite so alone anymore. But secrets like this don't keep themselves. In March, a group of hikers reported strange sounds in the northern section of the wilderness. Howls that didn't match any known animal. The state sent 2 additional rangers to investigate, and I spent 3 sleepless nights directing them away from the areas where I knew the creature hunted. I lied to colleagues I'd worked with for over a decade, falsified reports, and erased evidence of its presence. Each lie felt like swallowing glass, but the alternative was unthinkable. If they found it, if they saw what I was protecting, they'd come with guns and helicopters in fear. They'd kill it, or worse, capture it, cage it, turn it into a specimen for study. I couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't. The first real scare came that summer. A hunter found one of the creature's kills, a bull moose torn open in a way that wasn't natural. He brought the carcass to my station, demanding answers, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that makes men dangerous. I examined the remains carefully, keeping my face neutral while my heart raced. Then I lied with a confidence I didn't know I possessed. Bear attack, I told him. Probably a big male defending territory. The explanation satisfied him, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone saw something I couldn't explain away. That night, I hiked out to find the creature. It was waiting at our usual meeting spot, a clearing we'd both started to think of as neutral ground. I tried to explain the danger, using gestures and the strange communication we'd developed through months of careful interaction. We needed to be more careful. It needed to hunt farther away, avoid the areas where humans traveled. The creature watched me with those ancient knowing eyes, and I think it understood. Because from that day forward, I never found another kill site anywhere near the trails. Years passed like that. Seasons turned, and the secret grew heavier with each one. I turned down promotions that would have transferred me away from the Allagash. I stopped dating entirely, unable to explain the nights I spent in the forest or the exhaustion that never quite left my face. My colleagues began to whisper that I'd gone strange, too isolated, too deep into the woods. They weren't wrong. I had changed. The man I'd been before that October evening, the one who followed rules and lived small, that man was gone. In his place was someone who'd learned that compassion doesn't draw lines between species, that loneliness can be shared across impossible divides, and that some secrets are worth everything you have to give. But I also knew, with a certainty that kept me awake in the darkest hours, that this couldn't last forever. The beginning of the end came in the spring of 2004, 20 years after I first found that dying creature in the hollow. I was 61 years old then, my body wearing down from decades of hard living and countless nights in brutal cold. The Forest Service was preparing to open up new sections of the Allagash for recreational development. Hiking trails, camping areas, the kind of infrastructure that brings crowds. They sent surveyors into territory that had been wild and empty for as long as I'd known it. Territory where the creature hunted. Where it lived. I tried to stop it. Spent 3 months fighting the decision through every channel I could access, arguing for preservation, for the importance of maintaining truly wild spaces. But I was one aging ranger against economic incentives and political pressure. The development was approved. I knew what I had to do. The knowledge sat in my gut like ice, solid and undeniable. After 20 years of protection, of shared silence and strange communion, I had to make the creature leave. Had to drive it away from the only home it had known, the only safe space left in a world that would destroy it on sight. The decision broke something in me. I spent a week preparing, gathering supplies for one final journey, writing letters I'd never send, trying to find words for a loss that had no language. I went to the creature on a night in late May, when the forest was green and alive with the sound of returning birds. It was waiting at our clearing, as it always did when I approached. 20 years had aged us both. Its fur was grayer now, and it moved with a stiffness that mirrored my own aching joints. We'd grown old together in this strange companionship, man and myth, bound by a secret that had defined our lives. I'd brought fresh meat, the best I could hunt, and I laid it out like an offering, like an apology. Then I tried to explain. My voice cracked as I spoke about the surveyors, the development, the impossibility of staying hidden once dozens of hikers were traipsing through these woods every weekend. I pointed north toward Canada, toward vast stretches of wilderness even more remote than the Allagash. It needed to go, needed to disappear before they found evidence that couldn't be explained away. The creature listened with an intelligence that still, after all these years, took my breath away. When I finished speaking, it did something it had never done before. It reached out with one massive hand and placed it against my chest, over my heart. The gesture was gentle, impossibly gentle for something with such terrible claws. I felt the warmth of that touch through my jacket, felt the weight of everything we'd shared. The nights of healing, the hunts, the silent companionship that had saved us both from the worst kind of loneliness. Then it made a sound low and resonant that I understood was goodbye. It turned and walked into the forest, moving with that eerie, fluid grace that had terrified me so completely that first night. I watched until the darkness swallowed it whole, until even the sound of its movement faded into the ordinary nighttime chorus of the woods. And then I stood alone in that clearing and wept like I hadn't since I was a child. I never saw it again. In the weeks that followed, I hiked to every location we'd shared, searching for signs, for tracks, for any evidence that it remained. But the creature had done what I asked. It had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The surveyors came and went, finding nothing unusual. The trails were built. Hikers arrived with their bright tents and GPS devices, trampling through spaces that had been sacred in their emptiness. I continued my work, counting down the months until retirement, going through motions that felt hollow and meaningless. People noticed the change in me. They said I looked haunted. They weren't wrong. I retired in 2006 and moved to a small town in western Maine, far from the Allagash but still close enough to the wilderness that I could breathe. I've spent the last 15 years in this quiet house, living off my pension and the silence of my secret. Some nights I dream about that clearing, about the weight of a massive hand against my chest and pale eyes that held more understanding than most human beings I've known. I wake up and the loss is fresh all over again. Not just the loss of the creature, but the loss of purpose, of the strange certainty that came from protecting something precious and impossible. I'm 76 now, and I can feel time running out in the way my hands shake and my breath comes short after climbing stairs. That's why I'm telling this story, breaking 2 decades of silence to speak a truth no one will believe. Because I learned something in those 20 years that the world needs to understand. We draw lines around what deserves compassion, around what counts as life worth protecting. We tell ourselves that intelligence, dignity, and feeling belong only to creatures like us, that look like us, that fit our narrow definitions. But I've stood in winter storms beside something legend and fear created, and I've seen in its eyes the same loneliness and need for connection that drives every human heart. I've felt its gratitude and witnessed its trust, and I know with absolute certainty that the lines we draw are lies we tell ourselves to feel less alone in the vastness of creation. If the creature still lives, it's somewhere in wilderness so deep that humans may never reach it. I hope that's true. I hope it found others of its kind, or at least found peace in solitude. But some part of me believes it's gone now, the last of something ancient that couldn't adapt to a world growing smaller and more crowded every year. Either way, the secret I discovered wasn't about monsters or myths. It was about the terrible beauty of connection across impossible divides, about the price of compassion when the world demands conformity, and about the weight of love that can never speak its name. That's what terrifies me now, sitting in this quiet house with my memories. Not what the creature was, but what I became in protecting it. Someone who learned that the deepest secrets we keep aren't about hiding darkness, but about preserving light that's too strange, too wild, too precious for this ordinary world to comprehend. And that is a weight I'll carry to my grave, alone with the knowledge that once, in the deep woods of northern Maine, I wasn't quite so alone after all. Thanks for following the story. If you can, leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps YouTube share our content with more people. Also, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. That way we'll know where our viewers are from. Check out the other stories too. See you next time. Bye.